Oh, hi guys, it's me again. So I wanted to make a few more comments about the will because I realized I got into the conversation with my last video without really first setting up a nice conceptual structure for how we should think of the will in and of itself. Um, just as a concept and as an actual reality. Um, the will, eh, to the ancient man, was just a very fundamental aspect of reality that needed explaining. You don't see the arguments about free will existing in the ancient world in the same way that they do today. Again, and this has to do with the fact that our vision of reality is ultimately mechanistic today in popular general culture. But back in the day, I mean, there were questions about the will, but they were tied in necessarily the minute you started talking about them with fundamental questions about the ultimate nature of reality, the ultimate way to approach metaphysics, the correct vision of ethical reality. The will and the answer to the question of the will was tied in with all that. And nowadays, we still know it is somehow tied in with all that, but we don't want to put the pieces together, and we're okay just talking about the issue in a very sort of closed off way. And partially that's because analytic philosophy in general is also very compartmentalized as a field of study in the university system. So what is the will, and how may we understand the will in a way that can, in some sense, still make sense of everything we now do know about science and about causal reality? I mean, we don't want to throw away that kind of knowledge. What we want to do is integrate it in a way that allows us to maintain the kind of metaphysical vision that we should maintain for our both adherence to truth and for our own personal well-being in the world. And I think the answer is that the will must be reasserted now, again, as fundamentally as it was in the ancient world. The will must be again seen as a fundamental object in reality, as maybe the very object itself which determines outcomes of all sorts. That in some sense there's no separating any kind of causal order from the will. The will is present somehow in the very essence of what it means for things to exist. And I think there is a very simple way to look at this, which is thinking of the will as the selection mechanism. Basically, the will is that thing, that irreducible thing, which selects outcomes for causal systems about what the world is. And you have to think on a very abstract level to totally get this, but I think quantum mechanics, people can kind of make a lot of whatever they want of quantum mechanics, but there's actually quite a lot there to sink one's teeth into. And I think the concept's right there, in terms of how to integrate the will again with reality and the concept of measurement. Um, think of the will as the measurement mechanism itself, but instead of the measurement being something that is choiceless, that is just, I'm just measuring something out there objective, there's a sense where the measurement itself allows for a kind of freedom to pick among potentials. That at high levels, outcomes aren't determined specifically until one measures it in the way one, through one's intention. And again, how the mysterious nature of quantum mechanic reality sort of, fizzes up into general space-time reality is something that no one feels totally comfortable talking about by any stretch. Mostly it's denied that basically there's a quantum world and then somehow this world is stable. But I think that that's obviously false. I mean, it's just not how that's not how reality can function or does function, and I think we all know this, but we don't want to see how the analogy might work with what's going on at the quantum level in terms of measurement, and what's going on at the high stable quote unquote spatiotemporal level might be related, because it might actually have to affect your behaviors and the way that you approach reality as you navigate through it. So again, the only way to maintain the trueness of the will and the freeness of the will is to integrate it right at the core of reality. That ultimately, for anything to exist, the systems have to sort of self-measure. Any integrated system must self-measure to generate its conscious state, and that this self-measuring of its own potentiality is the will, and it's irreducible to anything else. So there's a certain extent where there will always be an empirical sense where the reasons for things, there's a gap between a fully satisfying reason for something that necessarily explains it and a reason that accepts the reality of the will and accepts that there's always an irreducible gap where it's just said for any contingent thing that that is what that thing chose. And it doesn't mean that that's not an explanation. It just means that that's not an explanation that satisfies the normal way we usually like to explain outcomes. But why? Why not believe that choice is just an irreducible but real phenomenon, and that trying to explain it on top through some other mechanism loses what the whole thing was about in the first place? That being said, one of the interesting things was as you move to higher levels of understanding, whether it just be in your own private life, seeing yourself in broader and broader cultural contexts, what you can realize is that in a way, you've been more determined than you ever believed. I mean, you've been determined by systems upon systems upon systems that have fed into you being who you are that you had no control over. So you come to realize that, in fact, you were more determined than you thought. But you don't feel like that was a denial of your will. I mean, what you did in the moment was still irreducibly yours. And, you know, maybe the probability distributions were not in your favor to do something else. I mean, maybe there is an abstract sense where you could have had 75% chance at that moment you could have done this, 25% chance you could have done that, and that's determined by the quantum thermodynamic situation you find yourself in. I mean, maybe God has that kind of information. But nonetheless, there's always this indeterminacy where it could have been otherwise. And retroactively, once you determine it, it does solidify it totally. I mean, it cannot have been otherwise because it's been measured as actual. I mean, this is a key idea. People talk about this kind of thing a lot in quantum mechanics and how it might relate to the will and consciousness. But just in relation to the will, it's just a conceptual thing. We don't even have to talk about quantum mechanics. All we need to talk about is making a model of the world in which the will is fundamentally irreducible to anything other than itself. And as long as we refuse to do that and try to fit the will into models, it will be a failure. And ultimately, you'll get a critique of the will like Sam Harris, who is a denier of free will. And he really goes to the end because he gets something very right. Obviously, he's really wrong about the will not being free. The will is free. But he gets the fact that it's not even just about the causal dominoes coming towards you. He makes the statement that in experience, he argues, you can know that you are not free. That through the realization that your own state and your own thoughts are being sort of determined from the outside, that you are not free. I mean, now this is a serious, I mean, this is not even a linguistic argument, really. It's an argument that presumably from within freedom, you can realize you're not free. Now, the problem is that there's a sense in which this is right. One state that one is currently in has this radical sense of determination. But on the edge of all experience is this potentiality sphere that it just cannot be reduced to anything other than itself. And there's no explaining, ultimately no explaining why I do one thing or the other. For sure, other than saying that that is what I did, and that is what I was determined to do by my own essence at that moment. And the choice to determine the potentialities through the determination of being, which already exists, is freedom. It is weirder than we thought. But just because you can exist in the moment realizing that your thoughts are, in some sense, external to you as much as reality is, as much as physical reality is, does not negate the primacy of the freedom of the will, which just is the irreducible measuring apparatus of reality that has come to contain, at this stage of evolution and this stage of consciousness, the intense selection of complicated concepts and meaning. I mean, a whole different ontological strata of what the will does exists in humanity through its complicated meta-understanding consciousness, its linguistic consciousness, its self-consciousness. The will is extremely, extremely important to be maintained as real and as a fundamental ontological statement of fact, faith, and truth. Lose that, and the human soul will be crushed, ultimately inside, deep down somewhere. And there is, and the passivity, maybe, of a spiritual reality that wants to accept that the will is not free, does create a kind of spirituality that someone like Sam Harris likes, where it's very sort of passive, meditative distancing. And there's great things about that, absolutely, but it's dangerous also, because the will is supposed to be engaged, even though it's totally submitting to the authority of love and God. But it's supposed to feel engaged. So that's what I wanted to say about the will right now. Again, the will will be a talk about the will, because society is probably more confused about this issue than almost any other. And once this gets in line with truth, a lot of things will follow. Okay, thank you very much, and God bless.